I still remember the afternoon. The trouble started as vividly as if it happened yesterday. I was hunched over a bare patch of soil, trying to coax some geraniums to grow along the edge of my front walkway, when a shrill voice over my shoulder made me jump. "You can't do that," the voice barked. I turned around, my heart hammering. A short, wiry woman in a peach-colored polo shirt and crisp khaki pants glared at me, her hands planted on her hips. That was my introduction to Lorraine Pierce, the newly elected president of our homeowners association. She was the kind of person who looked as though she wished for a bullhorn at all times, just to shout instructions from a distance. That day, all she had was her unwavering scowl. "Is there a problem?" I asked politely, wiping sweat from my brow. I was new to the area, so maybe geraniums were considered a capital offense in this community, for all I knew. Lorraine didn't hesitate. "Our landscaping guidelines prohibit any changes to the front yard without the express approval of the landscaping subcommittee. Do you have that approval?" Her lips pursed, reminiscent of a wasp about to sting. I offered a small smile. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I only planted a few flowers. I didn't realize." She thrust a laminated booklet at me. "Read it, memorize it, comply, and get those geraniums out, or you'll be fined." At that moment, I simply nodded. That was my introduction, but it was far from the last time Lorraine and the rest of the HOA board would appear on my doorstep over the most trivial, nonsensical rule violations. What started as a simple scolding about unauthorized geraniums escalated quickly. Within a week, I had racked up more warnings. My mail slot wasn't the right size, my lawn chairs were too close to the curb on trash day, and unbelievably, my mother's car was overly large for the driveway. I realized in short order that I'd moved into a neighborhood governed by an HOA that thrived on petty power plays. It would have been easy enough to just comply with their endless rules. But the day they threatened to ban my own family from visiting was the day they ignited the unstoppable chain of events that ended with my father banning them, in turn from the entire county. That might sound impossible. Surely, a private organization like an HOA can't keep your kin from stepping foot in your house, right? And what judge, no matter how well-respected or powerful, can turn the tables so dramatically as to forbid said HOA from existing in an entire county? I wouldn't blame you for being skeptical. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I would have shrugged it off as some outlandish exaggeration, a joke that had been passed around the gossip mill. But let me assure you, every ridiculous moment of it is burned into my memory. I had a front row seat. Actually, I was pretty much the main event for the high-stakes drama that would change our neighborhood forever. I grew up in a small but tight-knit family in the Midwest. My mother, Elaine, raised me to be courteous, to mind the rules, but never shy away from speaking my mind when I encountered something unfair. My father, Robert, was cut from a different cloth entirely. A stern figure in public, he was one of the toughest circuit court judges our county had ever seen. At home, though, he was surprisingly easygoing, unless you pressed the wrong button. Fairness, integrity, and respect for the law, those were his triggers. My father believed in treating people right and expected the same in return. Over the years, countless attorneys, would-be criminals, and occasionally even other judges learned not to cross him on ethical matters. So when I discovered that my mother and father, yes, the calm, principle-driven judge, were effectively barred from visiting me at my new house, I knew we were about to see my father's rarely unleashed wrath. How exactly does an HOA ban your parents? It started small, as these things often do. My parents pulled in my driveway one Saturday morning in my father's old, meticulously maintained 1968 Ford Galaxy. The next day, I received a complaint from the HOA about unauthorized guest vehicles. They argued that the Galaxy was not on the approved list for neighborhood parking because it was older than 20 years and did not meet environmental or aesthetic standards. Yes, apparently that was an actual rule in my neighborhood's covenants. To that, Lorraine appended a new condition, scrawled in red marker across my official warning notice. Repeated violations by the same visitor may result in a community-wide ban for that individual. At first, I tried to keep it from my father. I paid the nominal fine, assured the HOA that we wouldn't bring the Galaxy into the neighborhood again, and went about my business. I didn't want him to worry, and honestly, I found the entire thing so ridiculous, it wasn't worth stirring him up. After all, this was just a short-term fix. In my mind, we'd come to some middle ground, or the HOA would calm down once they saw how tidy I kept my property. Little did I know that Lorraine and her board had an appetite for conflict. They craved compliance, but more than that, they loved the spectacle of authority. Over the next few weeks, the fines ramped up. My father's very presence, even in a rental car, was a cause of neighborhood concern. Their official line was that the repeated visitation by disruptive guests is detrimental to the harmony of the community. Never mind that my father and mother did little more than drop off groceries and occasionally stay for Sunday dinner. What I failed to anticipate was how deeply this riled my father. He might not have known at first, but once he found out, there was no turning back. More than the fines, more than the haughty memos, more than the petty discussions about the color of my blinds, the attempt to effectively ban him from my home was what lit a blazing fire under my father, one that would lead to a dramatic county-wide reckoning. I still remember the afternoon. The trouble started as vividly as if it happened yesterday. I was hunched over a bare patch of soil, trying to coax some geraniums to grow along the edge of my front walkway, when a shrill voice over my shoulder made me jump. "You can't do that," the voice barked. I turned around, my heart hammering. A short, wiry woman in a peach-colored polo shirt and crisp khaki pants glared at me, her hands planted on her hips. That was my introduction to Lorraine Pierce, the newly elected president of our homeowners association. She was the kind of person who looked as though she wished for a bullhorn at all times, just to shout instructions from a distance. That day, all she had was her unwavering scowl. "Is there a problem?" I asked politely, wiping sweat from my brow. I was new to the area, so maybe geraniums were considered a capital offense in this community, for all I knew. Lorraine didn't hesitate. "Our landscaping guidelines prohibit any changes to the front yard without the express approval of the landscaping subcommittee. Do you have that approval?" Her lips pursed, reminiscent of a wasp about to sting. I offered a small smile. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I only planted a few flowers. I didn't realize." She thrust a laminated booklet at me. "Read it, memorize it, comply, and get those geraniums out, or you'll be fined." At that moment, I simply nodded. That was my introduction, but it was far from the last time Lorraine and the rest of the HOA board would appear on my doorstep over the most trivial, nonsensical rule violations. What started as a simple scolding about unauthorized geraniums escalated quickly. Within a week, I had racked up more warnings. My mail slot wasn't the right size, my lawn chairs were too close to the curb on trash day, and unbelievably, my mother's car was overly large for the driveway. I realized in short order that I'd moved into a neighborhood governed by an HOA that thrived on petty power plays. It would have been easy enough to just comply with their endless rules. But the day they threatened to ban my own family from visiting was the day they ignited the unstoppable chain of events that ended with my father banning them, in turn from the entire county. That might sound impossible. Surely, a private organization like an HOA can't keep your kin from stepping foot in your house, right? And what judge, no matter how well-respected or powerful, can turn the tables so dramatically as to forbid said HOA from existing in an entire county? I wouldn't blame you for being skeptical. If someone had told me this story before it happened to me, I would have shrugged it off as some outlandish exaggeration, a joke that had been passed around the gossip mill. But let me assure you, every ridiculous moment of it is burned into my memory. I had a front row seat. Actually, I was pretty much the main event for the high-stakes drama that would change our neighborhood forever. I grew up in a small but tight-knit family in the Midwest. My mother, Elaine, raised me to be courteous, to mind the rules, but never shy away from speaking my mind when I encountered something unfair. My father, Robert, was cut from a different cloth entirely. A stern figure in public, he was one of the toughest circuit court judges our county had ever seen. At home, though, he was surprisingly easygoing, unless you press the wrong button. Fairness, integrity, and respect for the law, those were his triggers. My father believed in treating people right and expected the same in return. Over the years, countless attorneys, would-be criminals, and occasionally even other judges learned not to cross him on ethical matters. So when I discovered that my mother and father, yes, the calm, principle-driven judge, were effectively barred from visiting me at my new house, I knew we were about to see my father's rarely unleashed wrath. How exactly does an HOA ban your parents? It started small, as these things often do. My parents pulled in my driveway one Saturday morning in my father's old, meticulously maintained 1968 Ford Galaxy. The next day, I received a complaint from the HOA about unauthorized guest vehicles. They argued that the Galaxy was not on the approved list for neighborhood parking because it was older than 20 years and did not meet environmental or aesthetic standards. Yes, apparently that was an actual rule in my neighborhood's covenants. To that, Lorraine appended a new condition, scrawled in red marker across my official warning notice. Repeated violations by the same visitor may result in a community-wide ban for that individual. At first, I tried to keep it from my father. I paid the nominal fine, assured the HOA that we wouldn't bring the Galaxy into the neighborhood again, and went about my business. I didn't want him to worry, and honestly, I found the entire thing so ridiculous, it wasn't worth stirring him up. After all, this was just a short-term fix. In my mind, we'd come to some middle ground, or the HOA would calm down once they saw how tidy I kept my property. Little did I know that Lorraine and her board had an appetite for conflict. They craved compliance, but more than that, they loved the spectacle of authority. Over the next few weeks, the fines ramped up. My father's very presence, even in a rental car, was a cause of neighborhood concern. Their official line was that the repeated visitation by disruptive guests is detrimental to the harmony of the community. Never mind that my father and mother did little more than drop off groceries and occasionally stay for Sunday dinner. What I failed to anticipate was how deeply this riled my father. He might not have known at first, but once he found out, there was no turning back. More than the fines, more than the haughty memos, more than the petty discussions about the color of my blinds, the attempt to effectively ban him from my home was what lit a blazing fire under my father, one that would lead to a dramatic county-wide reckoning. In the days following the so-called hearing, our entire neighborhood felt charged with tension, as though we were living under an invisible cloud that threatened to burst at any moment. The HOA members walked around with their chins elevated as if daring someone, specifically me or my father, to challenge them again. Our neighbors, many of whom I'd barely gotten to know, cast sidelong glances at our house. Some seemed sympathetic, offering tight smiles when I passed by. Others seemed strangely gleeful, or perhaps just curious, waiting to see who would break first. My father wasted no time. He started spending hours in the county records office, unearthing documents about the neighborhood charter, the HOA's incorporation papers, and everything else that might reveal chinks in their armor. One evening, he spread these documents across my living room floor and gave me a crash course in just how far an HOA's power could extend and, more importantly, where it stopped. He discovered an interesting fact. The HOA had only received its charter a few years earlier, under somewhat rushed circumstances. The county commissioners, strapped for time, had rubber-stamped a bunch of local HOAs without thorough review. That might not seem like a big deal, but to my father's legal mind, it suggested potential oversight issues that could be exploited. He also noticed that the neighborhood was originally zoned under certain restrictions that the HOA had apparently disregarded. For instance, a few vacant lots near the back of the community were supposed to remain open green space, but the board had quietly sold them to a local developer. That was a violation of the original covenant filed with the county. My father was collecting puzzle pieces, and each time he snapped one into place, he'd smile in that steely way of his that always meant trouble for whoever was on the opposing side. Meanwhile, Lorraine amped up her campaign of intimidation. She sent me letters about new infractions, one for not getting architectural approval for a small bird feeder I'd hung outside the kitchen window. Another for noise disturbance because a neighbor claimed to hear me vacuuming at 9 o'clock at night. While technically within quiet hours, it was apparently inconsiderate. And the most outrageous, a $200 fine for letting a neighbor's child use my lawn sprinkler because it could cause excess water usage. Every letter came with thinly veiled threats that if I continued to flout the rules, the HOA would take more drastic measures. Needless to say, I stopped paying these fines. It was a gamble, but my father instructed me not to acknowledge the sham. If they tried to place a lien on my property, we'd fight it in court. The real turning point came when we discovered how far Lorraine's pettiness could go. One Saturday afternoon, while I was out grocery shopping, my parents decided to surprise me by painting my living room. They brought drop cloths and paint, hoping to transform my bland walls into a light, cheerful yellow. Before they could even crack open a paint can, they saw the dreaded peach polo shirt striding up our driveway. My mother told me later how Lorraine hammered on the front door, brandishing some new directive that interior changes, even paint, required official review to ensure uniform aesthetic from the outside. Absolutely ridiculous, but it was another notch in Lorraine's quest to control every aspect of our homes. My mother politely informed her that the inside of the house did not concern the HOA. Lorraine threatened a daily fine until the unapproved color scheme was reversed. She even claimed that the color choice might be visible from the street if the curtains were open at night. When I returned home, I found my father seething, paint roller in hand. I'd never seen him more furious, except maybe once, when a known con artist tried to bribe him in court. That night, after Lorraine left a final note calling my father an ongoing trespassing violation, he told me he was done messing around. He called up a longtime friend who was also a circuit judge, explaining the situation in detail. I overheard fragments. Exceeds their legal mandate, restricting private property rights, possible abuse of authority, and, more ominously, seeking an injunction. For a moment, I had to wonder if my father was overreacting. Sure, the HOA was horrible, but was it worth a massive legal war? As if reading my thoughts, my father said to me, "Laws exist for a reason." The more I uncover about these people, the clearer it becomes. They're playing dirty, and they won't hesitate to rob you and other homeowners of your rights. I'm not stopping until they're held accountable. 2 weeks later, we filed suit in the county court, demanding an injunction against the HOA's enforcement powers until the matter could be sorted out. My father's friend, Judge Marion, agreed to set a hearing date. The HOA responded by rallying the community, spreading the word that we were troublemakers bent on destroying the harmonious environment they had worked so hard to cultivate. They started pressuring other residents to join them in testifying. They painted me and my father as a threat, not just to the board's authority, but to property values and the safety of the neighborhood. I was unnerved by how quickly neighbors turned. My father, however, had expected it. Fear, he explained to me, is a powerful tool. They're telling these folks that if we win, property values will plummet, the streets will be overrun by rebellious visitors, and the entire area will go downhill. He shrugged. They have no evidence, but people will believe what they're told if they're terrified enough. Privately, I worried. What if we didn't win? Or what if we won, but the HOA found another method to target us? Perhaps I should have just tried to keep my head down and coexist. But it was too late for regrets. Once the legal wheels started turning, there was no simple exit ramp. As the hearing date approached, tensions soared. My mailbox was graffitied one night with the words, "Go away," which might have been some neighbor's idea of defending the community. I started hearing whispers that the board had enlisted a fancy law firm from out of town, one known for fighting on behalf of large corporations. The message was clear. They wanted to crush us, to prove no one could challenge their power without paying a heavy price. But my father was not intimidated. If anything, the bigger the foe, the more determined he became. "You see, honey," he said, tapping the piles of documents stacked on our kitchen table, "they're going to learn a harsh lesson, that sometimes the rules they love to wield so freely can be used to bury them, too." When the day of the preliminary injunction hearing arrived, the courthouse was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors in one place, let alone a courthouse. It felt surreal, like an odd, small-town festival moved indoors, everyone waiting in stiff chairs instead of milling around a picnic. The people who'd come out to support the HOA carried a mixture of fear and indignation in their eyes, as though my father and I were launching a personal vendetta against them. Some recognized me, but no one waved or smiled. They just stared, which hurt me more than I'd expected. The HOA's lead counsel was a tall, silver-haired attorney named Walter Harris. Rumor had it he specialized in aggressive representation for HOAs and condominium associations across the state. He walked in with two assistants, both lugging thick binders. I overheard them discussing case law and strategy to uphold covenant authority. It was clear they intended to bury us in legal arguments. My father sat next to me in the front, quietly flipping through his own binder of evidence. He'd always had a stoic presence. Nothing flashy, no flamboyant gestures. Instead, he exuded the quiet confidence of a judge who knows his ground. Whenever Harris or his assistants glanced at us, my father simply nodded politely. It was almost disconcerting how calm he seemed, given the high stakes. When the hearing began, Judge Marion presided. He was a middle-aged man with a salt-and-pepper beard and sharp, dark eyes that missed nothing. I knew from the start that he was fair, but no pushover. We got right to business. Harris stood and launched into a well-polished spiel about how private communities are entitled to self-regulate, how harmonious living depends on the ability of HOAs to enforce covenants, and how my father and I were attempting to circumvent legitimate democratic processes by refusing to abide by lawful rules. It was stirring rhetoric, especially for the sizable group of supporters behind him, who nodded vigorously and occasionally muttered approval. He concluded by claiming that if the court issued an injunction against the HOA, it would set a dangerous precedent that undermines all community associations in the region. My father offered a small, tight smile, as if to say, "I've heard this all before." He stood and, in his usual measured tone, outlined the ways the HOA had overreached. He presented evidence of petty fines, intimidation tactics, and a shocking attempt to ban him from my private property. He quoted directly from the HOA's own documents, highlighting the absence of any authority to regulate who visits a homeowner. Then he introduced a brief mention of the questionable land deal in the neighborhood, though he teased it more than revealed it, leaving a sense that the board might have bigger legal skeletons in the closet. By the time my father finished, the murmurs behind us had grown uneasy. Even a few pro-HOA attendees looked uncertain. It's one thing to cheer for your board's moral stance. It's another to realize they might be playing fast and loose with property rights and potentially bigger violations. Judge Marion asked pointed questions of both parties. Harris kept insisting the HOA was well within its rights. My father politely disagreed, citing the precise lines in the bylaws and county code that contradicted Harris's arguments. Back and forth it went until late in the afternoon. Finally, the judge said he'd need time to review. He ordered a temporary stay of any fines or enforcement actions pending a final decision, which effectively meant the HOA couldn't punish me or ban my parents until he made his ruling. The crowd dissipated, buzzing with tension. Outside the courthouse, I heard neighbors grumbling that outsiders were interfering with the community's right to govern itself. Others seemed relieved that maybe, for once, the HOA's stifling control could be checked. Lorraine was nowhere to be seen. She'd slipped out a side door, presumably furious that the hearing hadn't resulted in an immediate victory for the board. In the following weeks, life quieted down slightly. The HOA no longer sent me daily fines. However, they ratcheted up a new tactic, social ostracism. My father and I found that neighbors suddenly forgot to invite us to community gatherings. The local coffee club that once greeted me warmly now offered curt nods. Even a friendly neighbor across the street, who used to chat about her rose bushes, hurried inside whenever she saw me coming. Still, I had my father's unwavering support, and, oddly enough, that was enough to keep me going. We were in a holding pattern until the judge made a final decision. Meanwhile, my father continued to research. He dug deeper into that suspicious land sale the HOA orchestrated. He pored over county records until late at night. One Sunday, after wading through a mess of incomplete real estate forms, he tapped the papers, a light in his eyes. "Here it is," he said. "They bypassed a major environmental review to get those lots sold. The board members likely profited personally from the sale. This is bigger than just planting flowers or banning old cars. It's potentially fraud. I stared at him. You think you can prove it? He exhaled slowly. If we can prove the HOA's board engaged in fraudulent practices, we can petition the county to revoke their charter. Without a valid charter, they can't legally operate as an HOA. No fines, no authority, nothing. He paused, letting it sink in. They threatened to ban my family. Well, if we dismantle their charter, they'll have no power to ban anything. Period. I suddenly felt giddy at the prospect. It seemed too good to be true, but I trusted my father's instincts. He didn't talk big if he couldn't follow through. That next Monday, he made an appointment with the county's legal counsel to discuss the matter. They were stunned by what he presented: a pattern of questionable paperwork, potential conflicts of interest, no official record of certain board votes. Enough red flags to warrant a thorough investigation. I wish I could say I felt only righteous delight, but part of me worried. If we did tear down the HOA, would the rest of the neighborhood blame us for ruining something they believed was protecting them? Then again, the board had turned so vicious that even neighbors who'd once supported them might breathe a sigh of relief if they lost their power. As the investigation began, rumors flew. Some claimed my father was out for personal revenge. Others whispered that the board president might go to jail. Every day felt like a waiting game. Waiting for the judge's ruling, waiting for the county investigation, waiting for the next salvo from the HOA. In that uneasy calm, I realized how deep the rot had grown, and I began to suspect that by the time this was over, the entire board, and perhaps the entire HOA, might be pulled out by the roots. A week after the county opened its investigation into the HOA's suspicious land deal, the storm truly broke. County officials subpoenaed financial records, meeting minutes, and personal documents from board members who had been in office during the land sale. As the county clerk rattled off the list of demanded materials, Lorraine's face reportedly turned white. She tried to file motions to stall the production of documents, but the judge overseeing that portion of the case wasn't swayed. The timeline was set, and the board had to comply or face contempt. The rumor mill exploded. Neighbors whispered about potential embezzlement. Some said the board had been skimming money from HOA dues to fund personal luxuries. Others speculated that Lorraine had ties to the developer who bought the land. A few people even claimed certain board members never actually lived in our neighborhood full-time, which, if true, would violate the rules for serving on the board in the first place. While all of this drama simmered, my father got a phone call from an old colleague who worked in the state attorney's office. The colleague expressed interest in the possibility of criminal charges if the county's investigation proved that the board had intentionally falsified documents. My father, carefully maintaining neutrality, provided what he knew but stressed that he wasn't leading a witch hunt. He simply wanted justice for the overreach that cost me and potentially other residents our rights. I, meanwhile, couldn't walk my dog without running into hushed conversations. I could practically feel eyes on my back, half the neighborhood trying to figure out if I was going to deliver the final blow that toppled the board. There was a strange loneliness in all of this. Even though I was at the center of the chaos, I had no real allies except my parents. People were either too scared to speak out against the HOA or too angry to see past the rumors. I remember calling my mother one evening and saying, "I wish none of this had happened. I just wanted a peaceful life in a nice neighborhood." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They forced our hand, dear. If they'd left you alone, we never would have found out about any of this. But they overplayed their power." Her words rang true, but it was hard not to feel a twinge of guilt that so many neighbors were now caught in a situation far bigger than a few petty fines. A few days later, I received a letter from a neighbor named Sandra, who lived on the far side of the development. She wrote that she and her husband had faced harassment from the board over a wheelchair ramp they installed for their adult son. The HOA insisted the ramp clashed with community design guidelines and threatened them with daily fines. According to the letter, we paid, we removed and reinstalled. We tried to compromise. Nothing worked. Then we had no choice but to move him elsewhere so he could have access. But it nearly bankrupted us. Sandra thanked me for standing up to the HOA and asked if they could offer any help with the legal battle. That letter nearly brought me to tears. It was the first tangible proof that my father and I weren't alone, that other families had suffered under the board's petty tyranny. I showed the letter to my father, who read it quietly, and then said, "If they want to fight, we'll give them one that protects people like Sandra and her family." He immediately reached out to Sandra, and by the end of the week, she had agreed to testify at any hearing about the board's intimidation. Meanwhile, the county's investigation turned up evidence that the board had, indeed, engaged in questionable financial practices. It wasn't quite an embezzlement smoking gun, but there were significant irregularities in how they handled funds from dues. The developer who bought the land lots had close personal connections to Lorraine. She'd once served on his real estate company's board. None of this was illegal outright, but the county attorney's office noted that the conflicts of interest were never disclosed to the HOA membership, as required by law. Suddenly, Lorraine and her cohorts found themselves on the defensive. They hired a crisis management consultant who encouraged them to hold a neighborhood informational meeting. I decided to attend, half out of curiosity. The meeting took place in the clubhouse, with over 100 residents cramped in rows of folding chairs. Lorraine tried to project confidence from the podium, but her voice trembled as she insisted that all funds were used responsibly and that any suggestion of wrongdoing is just a misunderstanding. Near the end of her speech, she let slip a rather telling line. "If we have to correct some paperwork errors, that's no reason to turn the entire community upside down." It was as close to an admission of guilt as I'd heard. A hush fell over the room. Then one brave soul raised his hand, a middle-aged man named Joseph, whom I recognized but didn't know well. He asked point-blank, "How do you justify banning someone's family from their own property if you claim all you want is to protect the neighborhood?" Lorraine flushed and stammered something about extreme measures and legal authority. But the atmosphere in the room had changed. People who once blindly followed the board seemed uneasy. They began talking in low murmurs. Another person asked about wheelchair ramps, referencing Sandra's situation. A third asked if he'd been illegally fined for painting his shutters. The questions came faster, each one poking holes in Lorraine's well-practiced spiel. Seeing the crowd become restless, Lorraine abruptly ended the meeting, her crisis management consultant at her elbow, hustling her away. I left in silence, but my mind was spinning. The weight of public opinion seemed to be shifting, if only slightly. Cracks were forming in the board's control. That was a victory, but it felt fragile. That night, I got a call from my father. He spoke in an energized tone I'd never heard before. "The county is recommending a possible revocation of the HOA's charter if they find a violation of the initial covenant. I've been asked to testify to help confirm the scope of their overreach." He paused, and his voice softened. "Honey, this might be our chance to not just stop them, but to protect every future homeowner in this community." My heart beat faster. In that moment, I realized we were on the brink of something far bigger than we'd ever anticipated. They had threatened to ban my family, but now the county was considering banning them entirely, at least banning their official status on the grounds of misconduct. My father had laid the groundwork, and soon we'd step into a hearing that could change everything. The final showdown took shape as a formal county hearing, a rare move reserved only for serious concerns about organizational misconduct. The hearing was set in the same courthouse where we'd attended the injunction proceedings, but this time it was the county commissioners who would be evaluating whether the HOA's charter should be revoked. That meant the entire board's authority, legally speaking, could be wiped out. Word spread quickly, and the day of the hearing, a sizable crowd assembled. Once again, neighbors, board members, and curious onlookers filled the seats. Outside, the local news vans lined the street. Apparently, a potential revocation of an HOA's charter was big news. Who knew? Meanwhile, the board's lawyer, Walter Harris, arrived with a small army of junior associates. Lorraine marched in at the head of the board members, looking pale but defiant. I felt a swirl of nerves. This hearing was bigger than anything we'd done before. It wasn't just about me and my father's personal grievances. This was about the entire structure of the HOA. If they lost their charter, the board's power would vanish overnight. No more fines, no more intimidation, no more attempts to control every facet of our neighborhood. But it also meant stepping into uncharted territory. How would the community function without an HOA? Would new leadership step in, or would we dissolve into some kind of property management chaos? My father, though, seemed calm and resolute. He wore his favorite navy suit, the one he typically reserved for officiating weddings or attending formal ceremonies. "Today's about the truth," he told me simply, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "We present our evidence, and the commissioners will decide if this HOA violated the law." The hearing began with opening statements from the county's legal counsel. They painted a picture of possible fraud, citing the undisclosed conflicts of interest, questionable land deals, and the board's approach to enforcement that went beyond its documented authority. Next, Lorraine's attorney spoke in her defense. He argued that any mistakes were mere clerical errors, that the board's intentions had always been above reproach, and that revoking the charter would unfairly penalize homeowners who depended on the HOA for services like landscaping and security. Then witnesses were called. Sandra was among the first. She described her family's ordeal, how the board kept fining them over a wheelchair ramp. Her voice quivered as she explained the financial and emotional toll. The commissioners listened intently, exchanging glances. After Sandra, Joseph testified about how he was threatened with a lien for painting his shutters a slightly different shade of white. Several more neighbors told similar tales of intimidation and arbitrary fines. Each story added another brushstroke to the portrait of an organization that had twisted its mandate into a power grab. I watched Lorraine carefully throughout these testimonies. She fidgeted in her seat, occasionally whispering urgently to Harris. Sometimes she pressed her lips together, as if stifling a retort. But the more neighbors spoke, the more sallow her expression became. Then my father was called. He stood, collected his notes, and moved to the front of the chamber. The commissioners asked him to detail the attempt to ban him from visiting me, to describe the bogus fines, and to confirm how the board had threatened to trespass him from private property. He answered each question with measured clarity, his voice steady as a rock. He referenced the specific clauses in the HOA bylaws that contradicted such an action. He also elaborated on the suspicious land sale, presenting the documents that showed Lorraine's prior relationship with the developer. "And in your professional opinion, Judge Lane," one commissioner asked, "does this constitute a breach of the fiduciary responsibilities of the HOA board under county guidelines?" My father nodded. "Yes, Commissioner. At the very least, it's a serious conflict of interest that was never disclosed to the community. Based on these actions and the pattern of intimidation, it appears the board has used its power in ways that go beyond its legal scope. Homeowners deserve transparency and due process, which has been systematically denied here." A wave of hushed murmurs rippled through the room. Once my father finished, Harris hurried to cross-examine, trying to frame my father as a biased party bent on revenge. My father remained unflappable, calmly pointing out that he had no personal gain in the matter. He simply wanted the board to follow the law and stop infringing on homeowners' rights. After the witness testimony, the commissioners asked Lorraine and the board members if they wished to speak. Perhaps realizing how cornered they were, Lorraine rose, chin trembling. She delivered a terse statement claiming that all board actions were done in good faith and that any suggestion of fraud was a misunderstanding. She tried to spin the blame back on troublesome homeowners who didn't like following rules. But her defensive tone and vague justifications seemed to do more harm than good. By the time arguments concluded, the tension in the room was unbearable. We waited while the commissioners deliberated in chambers. It felt like hours. Finally, they returned to deliver their decision. One commissioner cleared her throat, looking at Lorraine with sympathetic regret. Based on the evidence presented, this panel finds that the board of the Green Hill Homeowners Association violated critical aspects of its charter and failed to disclose material conflicts of interest in major transactions. We believe this behavior constitutes a breach of trust and disregard for county guidelines. The commissioner paused, glancing at her notes. "We therefore recommend that the HOA's charter be suspended pending further review, with the strong likelihood of complete revocation if these findings are upheld at the next level. In the interim, the board is barred from imposing fines, levies, or any restrictive policies on the homeowners of Green Hill. A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Some neighbors cheered quietly, others sat in stunned silence, and I saw at least one board member bury their face in their hands. Lorraine stood, mouth open, as if she couldn't believe it. For a moment, I felt almost sorry for her. Then I remembered all the havoc and harm she'd caused. She'd threatened to ban my family from the neighborhood, and now her entire organization was on the verge of being stripped of its authority. As soon as we stepped outside, local reporters swarmed my father. Microphones and cameras crowded in. "Judge Lane, is this a personal triumph?" asked one reporter. My father gave a measured response about fairness, the rule of law, and ensuring the rights of homeowners. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand attention. That wasn't his style. He simply stated that justice had been done, and he hoped the county's decision would encourage other HOAs to operate within their legal boundaries. The next morning, headlines blared. County suspends HOA charter. Residents relieved. The details splashed across local media, painting Lorraine and her board as overzealous enforcers who had finally been put in check. Phone calls and emails poured in from neighbors who had once avoided me. Some offered apologies for believing the board's propaganda. Others wanted to celebrate. A few, presumably board loyalists, left nasty voicemails. But the majority seemed ready to accept a future free of draconian HOA rules in the weeks that followed the county's decision. Our neighborhood underwent a strange metamorphosis. Without the HOA's looming presence, people suddenly seemed more at ease. The daily notices vanished. No one was prowling the streets with a clipboard to cite violations. My mailbox, once plastered with threatening letters, remained blissfully empty, save for normal mail. Folks strolled in the evenings, chatting with each other rather than hurrying indoors to avoid confrontation. The board, meanwhile, had scattered like leaves in a stiff wind. Lorraine, deprived of the official title that had fueled her self-importance, retreated to her house, refusing to answer the door or attend community gatherings. A rumor circulated that she might move out of town entirely, though I never confirmed it. A few of the other board members resigned publicly, writing letters of apology to the neighborhood and claiming they just followed Lorraine's lead. Whether that was true or not, they were gone, and with them went the toxic atmosphere of relentless control. Most of the day-to-day tasks the HOA once handled, like landscaping the common areas, were temporarily overseen by a volunteer committee that formed spontaneously. They did a surprisingly good job, mowing, trimming shrubs, even putting up new playground equipment in the small park. Residents donated time and money to keep things looking nice. Without the authoritarian approach, everyone seemed happier to pitch in. Meanwhile, the county's deeper investigation continued. It revealed enough financial irregularities to recommend permanent revocation of the HOA's charter. Though we didn't see any immediate arrests, proving criminal intent is never straightforward. There were strong indications that charges could be brought if certain board members didn't cooperate. By all accounts, the once feared Green Hill HOA would never operate again in any official capacity. And so the headline, "HOA banned my family from visiting, so my father, a judge, banned them from the county," became more than just a wild rumor. While he hadn't literally exiled them from county limits, the effect was nearly the same. Legally, the county commissioners were on track to ban the HOA from continuing as a governing entity. My father's stand against their overreach, combined with the county's own findings of misconduct, had effectively driven them out of business. The irony was as thick as honey. One weekend, as I was raking leaves in the front yard, my father pulled up in his old Ford Galaxy, free to visit without fear of fines. He stepped out, gave me a warm hug, and paused to admire the tree-lined street. "It's peaceful here," he said softly. "Yeah," I agreed, leaning on the rake. I almost forgot it could feel like this. Without the threat of another violation notice taped to my door, I can finally breathe. He nodded. "I'm proud of you, he said. "You stood up for yourself, even when it felt like the entire neighborhood was against you." I felt a lump in my throat. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." You took on the entire HOA when they tried to ban you. You pulled every legal string to make sure they couldn't get away with it. He smiled a little ruefully. It's what I do. But remember, you had the courage to bring this to light. We just lit the fuse on what they were already doing. Sandra and others were suffering in silence. Now, hopefully, they'll have a real say in what happens around here. It was a bittersweet moment. I'd never wanted to be the face of a battle against an HOA. All I'd wanted was to plant flowers, host my parents for dinner, and live quietly in a nice house. Yet here we were, standing in the aftermath of a legal war that had fundamentally changed our community. Eventually, we strolled over to Sandra's house, which she and her husband were busy renovating with a new ramp for their son. Without the HOA breathing down their necks, they could make the home properly accessible. I never dreamed I could do this without a fight, Sandra told me, tears shining in her eyes. Thank you. Thank your father for me. I squeezed her hand, and my father assured her it was our pleasure. Other neighbors also began to open up, sharing stories of harassment, forced repainting of doors, uprooted gardens, invasive property inspections. For all their fear, they seemed relieved to finally speak. A small group of residents even gathered to discuss forming a more reasonable association, strictly limited to communal upkeep, none of the controlling nonsense that had defined the old HOA. As for Lorraine, she put her house on the market a few months later. A for sale sign appeared in her yard quietly one morning, and a week after that, a moving truck arrived. She never said goodbye. No official farewell letter. One day, she was just gone. Rumor was that she took a job in another county, perhaps try to start fresh. Maybe she'd eventually try to run another HOA somewhere else, though hopefully she'd learn a lesson about overreaching. In the aftermath, the county commissioners held a final review session and voted unanimously to revoke the charter. The official decree stated that the Green Hill HOA was dissolved due to sustained malfeasance, failure to comply with original covenants, and disregard for homeowners' basic rights. It was the first time in our county's history that an HOA had been forcibly disbanded. The news stations replayed segments of the hearing, calling it an unprecedented move and highlighting the judge, a father, who overturned an entire HOA to protect his daughter's rights. Some of them played it up for drama, but at its core, it was a simple story of principle. Once the dust fully settled, a remarkable calm took hold. A group of younger families organized a block party, the first real community event in years that wasn't overshadowed by board rules or intimidation. Kids played, dogs wagged their tails, and folks laughed freely. I invited my parents to join, and there my father was Judge Robert Lane, tossing a beanbag in a cornhole game with a grin on his face. It reminded me of when I was little and he'd help me ride my bike. Calm, steady, unwavering. A neighbor approached him, tipping his cap. Never thought I'd see an HOA get run out of town, he joked. But I'm sure glad you did it. We can finally enjoy ourselves. My father nodded politely, then looked over at me with a twinkle in his eye. When the law is on your side, he said softly, sometimes all it takes is standing up to the bully at the right moment. And that was the final lesson in all this. That bullies can't stand when their authority is questioned, but they'll topple quickly once confronted with real, steadfast resolve. The HOA had tried to ban my family from visiting, but in doing so, they set in motion the chain reaction that ended their reign. With their charter revoked and their powers stripped away, they were effectively banned from operating in our county. To this day, every time I look at my father's old Ford Galaxy parked in my driveway, I remember how this all began. An outdated car, some geraniums, and a few petty letters that spiraled into a legal storm. It reminds me that while standing up for your rights can be painful and lonely, the payoff, freedom and respect, can be worth the fight. And it reminds me of the quiet strength my father always carried, a sense of justice that wouldn't let him back down, even when the odds seemed stacked. I kept those geraniums, by the way. They're not just flowers anymore. They're a symbol of a hard-fought victory and the day my father, a judge with an unshakable moral compass, taught an overbearing HOA what real authority looks like. The end.